Start.
I'm ready to start. Is everybody ready to start?
Sounds good.
Okay, so there is a place where you can type in the chat box, you can type in any questions that you have. And that's a really good way to do it because then as the PowerPoint's rolling along, then, you know, whatever questions that come to you, go ahead and type them in rather than speaking because everyone's vote, you know, can conflict. And then I'll answer the questions as we go, kind of work them in so that, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end too. So not to worry, but everybody gets to ask questions. You don't have to just sit there and listen to me drone. So, so today's workshop is on stealth composting and urban stealth composting. And the reason for bringing this out is because urban gardeners have special challenges. You know, you don't have all of this space that you might have in other situations. You know, someone says, well, you just throw it behind the woods or whatever. We don't have that. So the first thing to remember is that although there's a lot written about composting and there are very helpful guides and all that, composting is a cycle and it will continue on its own. And it's like, you know, the water cycle or the nitrogen cycle or the nutrient cycle or any of those, it will continue on its own. And it's only when we interrupt it that it stops. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get it out of our current wave cycle, which basically takes perfectly good nutrients and then seals them up into a landfill or something like that, or they're just buried so that they can't be used again. And to get everything that came out of the soil back into the soil. And this is something that we, even though we're in an urban situation, we can do that. So you can see here, there's some pictures of cycles, and there's a lot of them on the internet, but it's basically just showing that anything that comes out of the ground, like plant materials, even weeds, clothing like clothing that can no longer be worn, it can be used as a rag, and then as long as it's cotton or some kind of natural fiber, then it actually can even be composted too. Okay, so this. And our next slide. Okay, so compost happens. This is in the woods. No one is going out there and measuring the temperature or turning it over to aerate it or doing anything like that. Trees drop their leaves, that saves their resources, but also the leaves then break down. They smother out competition, but they break down and restore all the nutrients to the soil that went into producing the leaves in the first place. So we're going to try to emulate that rather than trying to put everything into a trash truck. So here are some ways that composting is done. On a large scale, you have these big windrows and it requires a lot of equipment and a lot of space. But, and then this is something that we use in DC in our compost projects. Here, this would be medium scale. It's still too large for obviously you couldn't have one of these in an apartment, although you could join. DC does have, DPR does have a composting project and anybody can join and you can take your compost scraps there. But this also is too large to have on an individual basis for most of us. So here's what is important in composting. As far as measuring, you don't have to measure how much nitrogen and all of this, how much carbon you have to mix them together. You want to just be aware of how your compost is working. And with students, I teach FBI, you know, fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates. Actually, there's more involved in composting than that. There's temperature, you need moisture, you need air, mold, all of those things are part of the process. But this is the basics. It's all those little critters will come to it as long as you have contact with the ground. So here's our challenge. We're trying to integrate the compost process with urban spaces. And what are we going to try and compost? Well, anything that you can think of, and I hope lots of people will write in ideas of things that could be composted and would benefit the soil. Food waste, garden waste, which would include branches, leaves, weeds. You don't want to throw away weeds. Your best soil is clinging to the roots of those weeds. Household waste, like clothing that can't be used for rags anymore, even hair and cardboard. All of that is something that is produced in an urban environment that can go in and then benefit your soil. Now, step one is you need to collect all the items that you're going to compost. And this is an item that I have found to be very useful because most of the containers are either very expensive or they encourage use of plastic liners. And even unstable plastics that are meant to degrade in home composting are still adding plastic to the soil, and the soil really probably has enough by now. So this you can line with paper. This is lined with some paper that was used in a package that we received. You can use newspaper if you receive a newspaper. You can use any large piece of paper can be folded and used for this. It was designed for use with newspaper, but fewer people receive the paper. But you can use anything just to allow air in, and having it open and not collecting moisture under a lid, it tends to attract fewer fruit flies or have any odor. And then the lid on top prevents you from having to look at all that stuff. And this is some actual food waste from our kitchen. Now, one approach is to hide your compost in plant pots. If you're going to plant something, a lot of times if you live in an urban environment, you're going to be buying potting soil or potting mix, which can get to be expensive. So using your flower pots and plant pots for hiding this compost serves two purposes. One is it allows you to compost, and allows you to compost in something that no one knows that compost is inside of. And if you fill it up halfway with compost, then you have reduced your potting soil cost in half. So it has double benefits. And in addition to that, as the materials compost, they're going to break down invisibly and without odor underneath the soil where you have your petunias or whatever growing. And that soil then at the end of the season, when you go to use it again, is enriched when you mix the compost into it. So you don't have to do, sometimes companies that sell these potting mixes recommend that you discard it and buy more of their product, which you really don't have to do, particularly after you have improved it with your compost. The little link there to YouTube shows a gardener who demonstrates how she does her composting in totes and things like that in her outdoor garden, and just covers them with soil so that they don't have any odors. And she does not have any piles. They don't fit into this small amount of space that she has for gardening. So that's a link to go to. Now, I'm a big fan of grow bags of all sizes. This is a geotextile, so again, there is plastic, but this is a very durable material. They last for years, and I find that plants like tomatoes and potatoes, sweet potatoes, grow really well in these. And it's a great way to grow sweet potatoes because at the end of the season, when you want to harvest, instead of having to dig down 20 inches in our hard DC soil, you can dump it out onto a tarp so that you can use the soil again. So in this one, we have an empty bag at the top. That's one. And then pulled a bunch of weeds in the garden. You don't want that plant material to be lost. So that's step two. And then put some wood chips or leaves or other material like that that will add carbon. It can also be shredded junk mail, whatever. I'd recommend removing the envelope, the plastic windows in the envelopes, but shredded paper, anything like that for carbon. And then four is top it with the some type of soil, your potting mix or potting soil, which are different but either one will work. And then you can plant right into it. Most of the plants that you're planting, like if you're growing pepper plants or cucumber seeds or something like that, they only grow in the top few inches, and they will take moisture, etc., out of the lower inches, but they will not be bothered by having the materials that are decomposing. You'd think that maybe it would cause their roots to decompose, but it doesn't. They do well with it, and particularly tomatoes. So that's one way of using the grow bags, and I highly recommend it. The grow bags after the growing season, in the fall, when you have leaves, if you do have outdoor space with leaves, this is a good place to store your leaves. Just fill up the grow bags with leaves. Another way to compost is in raised beds. If you do decide to build raised beds, instead of again filling it with soil that you purchase, which would become very, very costly, instead put the bottom layers, fill them up with branches and coarse materials like that, waste from your garden. So as you put in a new bed, take all of the waste that you have in your garden and put it in there first, and then just put soil on top. There's a method of gardening called hugelkultur, which is covering over a tree, covering over wood like branches with some sod, and then gardening on that. And as the wood decomposes, it holds moisture and nutrients to the soil. So in this way, that's usually a large garden. In this way, we're doing miniature hugelkultur by putting branches in the bottom. But twigs, anything like that will work. And if you see the lower garden down there, the little wooden raised bed, let's see. Yeah, right there. This one also has a compost tower in it. So the bed was made out of wood, untreated actually in this case, and it was filled up halfway with compostable materials. And then the white pipe that you see in the center has a green lid on top, which can be removed. And you just drop your compostables into that tower. There's holes in it, and worms and other critters in the soil can go in and out through that in an ongoing process. So do we have any questions or anything? Okay, so let's go on to our next one. So now the next thing you can do is you can make garden towers. These are when you can, here is one that you can actually buy that has a composting tube down the center of it. So as you drop stuff in and it breaks down, you can add water to hasten it. You can put worms in it if you want to, if you don't want to actually buy composting worms. You can take some soil, some live compost, or you can take some soil that is active and has lots of eggs and things like that, and then to jump start it, that will add the microbes and the worms, whatever, into the tower. You don't want to fill it, but you put in a few handfuls. And then as you add things, if there's something that's particularly rambunctious, you can put a little bit of soil on top of it. But basically, you just keep a lid on it. Here, an upside down flower pot will work. Here is a homemade one that we did. We just have a pipe that's a drainage pipe that's down the center one, down the center, and it goes up the middle of the pots. You just have to take these plastic pots and expand the hole, make the hole large enough that a pipe can go down all of them. And then this one is a one that you can build using clay pots. It's more difficult they're more attractive, but it's more difficult to expand the hole in clay pots. You have to be careful with how you drill them so that you don't crack them. But the same idea, you can have a center pipe that has holes in it, so that as you drop compost in from the top, it falls down to the bottom. You can also water through that pipe. And then these plants are actually planted in the soil that's on top of all this. So there's a soil layer on the outside and a compost layer in the middle. And it's fairly invisible. And if you have a cap on top of it, it keeps it from drying out. And it also keeps it attractive. Okay, so here are some more examples. Here's a cross section of the worm tower, how it can be made. Here's a picture of one in place. This is the same one that we had earlier. And then here's a how-to. You can just take anything. You can make a wooden box. You can take a pipe. You can do anything like that. You want to make sure that there's plenty of holes drilled in it. You don't want any holes in the above ground part. You just want it in the soil exchange part so that worms can go back and forth. And so when you water at the top, it can come out through the holes and help distribute it. One of the main advantages to composting this way is that it basically empties itself. The compost is taken out of the compost by movement of animals below ground, and the water also helps it to go out. So instead of pulling a weed out of the garden, taking it over to a compost bin, turning it and composting it and everything, and then hauling it back to the garden, you're composting right in the garden so that it is stays in the garden. It doesn't have to be carried anywhere. And then, so the worms are doing the work for you, and there's several different examples of what you can do to make sure that you don't have any insects or anything coming there. One is to use this fabric so that you don't have to worry about that. So here's a question.
All right. Hi, I'm the question reader tonight.
This is Andrew, and he's reading the questions.
So first question, I do have a question about whether or not you advocate putting landscaping fabric down into raised beds.
This is to protect the wood. I've read about that, and I think it wouldn't harm anything. It adds an extra step to it, and it might protect the wood. I've actually decided to go, most of the time, go with lumber, realizing that it's going to rot. And I'm still looking for the perfect wood treatment that is non-toxic. And so I have limited experience with landscaping fabric. In the few beds that I've had at school, we found that it tends to come loose and doesn't always stay in place. But it's not a bad idea to try to protect the wood. Another way of making a bed is to have the sub-irrigated beds, and those are a great idea to save you for watering, but it's difficult to do that in wood, so you'd have to put pond liner. So
presumably you could just make a tower in the ground too.
Absolutely. And you can use something along the lines of a little bit larger than these small pipes. You could take something like a plastic trash can or a metal trash can that has a lid, sink it down into the soil with holes just like we had in the pipe, and then you would be able to drop your compost into the trash can, or beautiful wooden blocks, just depending on what you're up to making and have the energy to do, and put a little soil on top to prevent any odors or fruit flies or filth flies or anything like that. But it could also just decompose into the ground. Water it periodically if it gets dry, and put some leaves or wood chips or something like that on top if it gets too wet. Okay.
Follow-up comment about the landscaping fabric to prevent weeds, and particularly the Bermuda grass, from getting into the soil.
Well, that could be one of the reasons. I have and certainly no harm in it. We have a method of dealing with Bermuda grass as we get farther along. If it does keep weeds from getting in, that's a nice benefit. It does add to the expense, but I would like to have, if you try it, if you would share the results. I think it would be, great to hear about them. As I said, we have found, I've had limited use with them, and they have been somewhat successful, but the fabric also comes unstapled in the exuberance of gardening. So I think it would work very well with an all adult gardeners, but with enthusiastic kids, it may not, they don't always seem to stay put.
And Lou comments that I plan to make a tower with Norman bricks this week.
Well, that sounds good. I think that would be perfect, because if it's using something that you have on hand and have the water to be able to go in and out, worms to be able to go in and out, and all the little invertebrates that come in and out, that can do it. So go for it.
Right.
Okay, so that's one example. Now here is a Kambha tower, and we have one of these. And this is from India, and it's another way of stacking up pots to compost right on your balcony, on your terrace, on your patio. And if you're really short on space, one of those. If you're really short on space, this is a great way to do it. We're going to play a video on how it actually works, but these are terracotta, so you have to protect them from being in the rain around here because we have freezing temperatures, and you don't want to have it with your exuberant puppies. But the idea is that the bottommost one is filled with something like wood chips to absorb the moisture as it drains. And then here is the pot. So you just take, we put, because we have little pets, we put rubber bands on it to keep the lid from falling off. But you just put your compost right inside.
I'm not almost sure what you're seeing right
Okay.
now. So hang on a second.
Are you seeing this pot?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
And so you just drop your compost in here. You put paper inside, and then there's some mix that you have that you can add into it that has microbes in it. You can also use plain garden soil. And you just keep filling them up and then moving them from position to position. And it's a very nice way to be able to compost in a small space. And you can also get the version that is a 5-gallon plastic bucket. That's the same idea, and a little bit more economical than having something that's handmade like this, but it doesn't breathe quite as well, of course, as the natural terracotta does. Obviously, you do not have to go and buy one of these. This is imported. You could make the same sort of thing out of with terracotta pots, and just put saucers on top of them as lids for the layers.
All right, so you got the video now?
Yeah.
All right.
All right, so we're going to put on our video, and this is for encouraging people to compost in very, very densely settled cities where a terrace is as most space as most people have. And here we go.
We have technical difficulties.
Oh,
here,
well.
folks. Hang on. We'll get there.
It's this. Or maybe we'll come back to it.
Here it is.
Congratulations on being the proud owner of a daily dump composter. Having the right spot for your new friend. Ideally, it should be on a flat surface, like the corner of a terrace, balcony, or garden, and preferably sheltered from heavy rains and pests. In this video, we're going to show you how to compost using this product in just 5 easy steps. You will need your composter, some waste, some dried leaves, some newspaper, remix powder, microbes, a rake, and a sieve. Step 1. Segregate all your waste. If you don't segregate, you cannot compost. Keep your kitchen waste separate. Here's today's kitchen waste from my home. You can look at your manual or the website to see the full list of what can and cannot go into your composter. Step 2. Prepare your composter. This tank composter has 3 units, A, B, and C. I'm going to put dried leaves in unit C up to the height of 4 inches. This is to absorb the extra water released during composting. I'm going to then put newspaper on the mesh of units A and B. I'm going to put 4 fistfuls of remix powder on top of the newspaper in unit A. Now my composter is ready to take in my kitchen waste. Step 3. Add kitchen waste. I'm going to add kitchen waste on top of the remix powder in unit A. Cover this with 3 to 4 fistfuls of remix powder. No waste should be seen. Add a sheet of newspaper on top of this to keep away fruit flies. It acts as an inner cover. Close lid. The next day, when you want to put waste in, remove the newspaper sheet, add the waste, cover with remix powder, put the same sheet of newspaper back in, and close lid. Repeat this every day till Unit A is full. Step 4. Maintain and repeat. Now Unit A is full. Now when Unit A is full, I'm going to check for moisture. Now I'm going to add 2 spoons of microbes, and if it's too dry, I will add some water, and if it's too wet, I'll add some remix powder and stir it in. Now place Unit A in the place of Unit B. Bring Unit B on top. Now do the same thing with Unit B. Add your waste, add remix powder, add a sheet of newspaper, and do this daily till Unit B is full. Once Unit B is full, you'll need space. So you will take the contents of Unit A, which would have shrunk in volume, and empty it into Unit C, and bring Unit A back on top. So the cycle continues. Step 5, check compost and remove. Once all your units are full, you need to check the contents of Unit C. If the material in Unit C is not fully composted, you must transfer the contents to another pot or bucket, add some water and microbes, stir it up, and let it mature for another month before you use. All the large pieces that are left after sieving, I'm going to put back into fresh waste. Voila! You are now a certified composting ustad. In just 5 easy steps, you and your family keep at least 25 kilos of organic waste out of landfill every month. Just maintain the cycle. Keep it going. Use the compost in your garden and watch how the plants slurp it up. And if you don't have a garden, just take it out and sprinkle it on the neighborhood trees.
Okay. So that is one particular product. Now, obviously, you may not have all of those things. The website here, EcoRich, that's where you can get those, and you can also get the less expensive 5-gallon stackables. You could make some of your own. And for the remix powder, you can use soil, you can use the cocoa core, and all types of things like that, like the core bricks.
And the question is, what's in the remix powder?
Well, it is cocoa core, and they also have some microbes, the same sort of thing that you would use in a Bokashi mix. So you could use a Bokashi mix, and you can also use some compost that you've already made, and you can use some garden soil. They do ship some of the remix powder with it, and you can order it from EcoRich to get more. All right, then here's another stealth composting system. Underneath stepping stones, you can dig a little hole under there, put a stick underneath the stone so that you have a handle to lift it up, put your compost underneath the stepping stone, and then just let the stepping stone sit down again. The natural water of rain and everything will seep in, and it will slowly decompose. If you have a pathway, this is not particularly urban looking, but if you have a pathway, you can make a small hole under every stepping stone and fill them up. It will give you a lot of space. It's not particularly easy to harvest the compost this way, but at least it's going back into the earth, so it serves a purpose. And then here's another one, is the same idea. If you have an area where you can garden, like in a community garden or a backyard or a terrace area, you can dig a trench in the soil that you have, put the items that you want to compost, as you see in the picture in the upper left-hand corner. And with every addition of food waste, you put a little bit of soil on top of it, so that you're gradually filling up the trench. After the trench is full, you can plant right on top of the soil that's over top covering the compost. Plants are actually quite tolerant of this underneath them. It's part of the process. You know, the trees are not all worried about the leaves that are about their roots. They can do very well this way, and that gives you a chance to incorporate compost into your garden. One caution about this, though, is that you wouldn't want to be putting something that's extremely attractive to animals that might be wandering in your neighborhood. Meats are particularly attractive, so trying to stick with something that's going to stay a little bit low profile goes along with our stealth approach here in trying to keep it under wraps. There is a a link there to Gardener's World that has pictures and more details on how to do this. But basically, you're just digging a trench in your garden and filling it up with compost gradually, or you do it all at once, and then just planting it on top. So the space is not committed or relegated to being a compost heap. It's actually actively in the garden. And then another way to compost materials is, instead of buying a plastic netting or buying a frame to grow your peas on or something along those lines, is to take any twigs that you might have, if you are lucky enough to have trees, or if you decide to take out a bush, to cut it up into bits. And on the terracing there, those branches are a bush that had failed, and so we're using all the branches from the bush. Instead of bundling them up and discarding them, we're using them actually to help hold the soil on a bank, and I think it looks fine. On the left, you'll see there are trellises to grow beans on, or you just need to stick twigs into the ground to help peas, have some stability that they need to grow and to produce better. Eventually those will break down, and then you can just hide them under the soil. Now, leaves are so often thrown away in the city. You see big piles of leaves that are raked out in the street, where they can get contaminated with waste from cars and so on. And it's such a shame, because they're such a wonderful addition to your garden. So on the left, you'll see a tower that is specifically made for composting leaves. It's open so that the rainwater will come in and hasten their decomposition. And it has a door at the bottom so that you can take leaves out from the bottom to use in your garden when you want to. This design could certainly be adapted to your own space and the materials you have, using fencing or whatever, if you wanted to build it. It doesn't have to be rectangular. On the right are garden fences. There was a group of people in Seattle, and it spread. Instead of building a fence with a single layer of wire fencing, they built it with a double layer of wire fencing, and then put their compostables like sticks and leaves and everything in between the two layers of fencing. It shrinks, the materials go down at the bottom. You could leave it somewhat elevated from the bottom so that you could take the compost out from underneath it. It is important when you do that to make sure that you keep it moist, because you don't want it to become a place where a pest would hide out in. But birds like wrens actually like the top parts of it because they like the cover. And one aid in composting leaves is, if you have a lawnmower, is to run over them with a lawnmower and chop them up into smaller pieces, and they will decompose faster and they'll take up a lot less room. And then they can be put into those grow bags that we were showing at the very beginning, or there are other geotextile bags that you could put them in, or maybe paper bags, and as a last resort, plastic bags. The bins to the right are simple fencing bins, and you can fit them into a corner, any space that you can make available for the leaves, and hold them, use their vertical space so that they take up less room, and then put something around them, put them behind taller plants so that they're not as visible as these are. And then getting the revenge on weeds like Bermuda grass. Some weeds, if you just throw them into bags or you throw them into a compost bin, can regrow from small bits. An example would be Bermuda grass, or bindweed, or mugwort. A lot of these weeds are very, very difficult to get rid of. So here's an example. In this one picture to the left, they're making comfrey tea, which is particularly nutritious as a fertilizer, a liquid fertilizer. But you can really put any weed into a water bath. You'd want to have a lid on it because it is going to become anaerobic, and it will have that smell like water that in a flower vase that's been sitting too long. And of course, you don't want to be breeding mosquitoes, so you can toss a mosquito dunk in there. The ones with the lid are better. They can hold in the odor. This bucket could be put in the shade. And you can use a bag for steeping it, like a tea bag, like a painter's nylon paint filter bag can be used so that you can remove the leaves and everything on the leftover. But the main point with this is to allow it to decompose anaerobically quite thoroughly, and then save the liquid, dilute it, and use it as fertilizer in your garden. The nutrients that are contained in something like Bermuda grass or comfrey or any other weed like that can then be put back into your garden with a minimal amount of work, and you don't have to worry about them regrowing in your garden. So you no longer have to throw away those weeds that can reproduce from pieces. Grass is particularly susceptible to rot, so it doesn't take very long for grass to be killed by being soaked in water. Ideally, start with rainwater if you can. If you can take the lid off your container and allow it to collect rainwater, because the microbes can grow more easily in water that has not been treated with chloramine or chlorine. But if that isn't available, the chemicals usually, they will break down over time and get tied up with the pieces of the vegetation, and it will still ferment. But I do warn you, it's going to be a little smelly, but it's smelly in a harmless way. Then this is an indoor system, or you can do it outside, but Bokashi. This would warrant an entire workshop all on its own on how to do it. You can buy one of these containers that has the little faucet at the bottom to drain off liquid, and you can also make your own. 5-gallon buckets are good for it. And when we were talking earlier about the microbes, Bokashi has been treated. It's usually something like wheat germ or some kind, or rice hulls that have been treated so that there are microbes in there that rather like bread yeast that will grow and ferment. This is done as opposed to most of the composting we've been talking about, but like the bucket of water, this is done anaerobically, so it's different microbes, and this is a particularly good use if you eat meat. This is a good way to put meat scraps and other things like that that are difficult to compost without attracting pests, and sprinkle on the Bokashi grains, and it will anaerobically ferment. It doesn't change much in structure visually, but it will ferment, and it becomes less attractive to animals over time. And then that is buried into your compost, your trench compost. It's a great way to deal with waste that you wouldn't be able to do easily compost outside, and it can be done totally inside. It doesn't require an outdoor space except to empty it periodically. And it can handle all different kinds of products that you can't easily handle in an outdoor compost. So, as you can see, a big composter is optional. You can still compost. There's a lot of ways of doing it without having to take up a lot of space. And all of these that we've been talking about today can be expanded on. All right, so what questions do we have? What ideas? What has been missed and should be in the next one? Yeah. So you can unmute yourselves. Let's unmute.
So this is Janie again.
Okay.
I have a worm tub inside that I've been using. I found a guy online named Mark Payne, P-A-Y-N-E or P-A-I-N-E, and he promotes vertical gardening and vermiculture, or vermenting, excuse me, vermenting. And
Okay.
what he does is, because worms have tiny mouths, he takes all of his, and I mean all of his organic material, including human manure and chicken bones and all of the normal composting things. He grinds it into a disposal, makes a slurry that he strains, and with the paste of his compost, makes these burritos out of newspaper, packs them in bins, throws in some worms, and lets them sit for 8 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I've done sort of a slight version of that, where I grind my compost with my little wand, my little,
Yeah.
wand blender.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that they really love it. Now, here are my questions. I've stuck with the more traditional composting, the veggies. I haven't used urine or a dead chipmunk as he has.
Where are my dead chipmunks?
Yes, dead squirrels. He was even processing a raccoon that way at some point. Anyway, so I find that even living alone, I have so much compost that I have now a freezer full of these burritos of pureed stuff. Can I stick those right in my raised beds outside and just let the earthworms
Yes, you
enjoy
can.
them?
In fact, for the earthworms, you wouldn't have to prepare it that thoroughly.
Yeah.
But the fact that you do makes it easier for them. But the worms do have little mouths. You don't have to grind it up. I mean, not that it doesn't hurt anything to grind it up.
Yeah.
But if molds and fungi can get to it, they are part of the whole process of breaking it down so that the worms with their dainty mouths can then eat it. And it also breaks it down so it's accessible to them.
Great.
So all of the other action that you will find in live garden soil will take care of all that stuff and be able to break it down. There are a few exceptions. Eggshells are hard to break down, so if you crush them, that really helps. My habit is to drop the eggshells into the coffee grounds because we use a paper filter, and crush it there, and then they're at least small bits, so that it will take a long time for that calcium to become available, but it does make it available sooner than if it's whole. And of course, you've been doing that with grinding it so very thoroughly. But if you bury it in your garden beds, like make a trench and put all of those down in there, they will break down. And if you go and check at, in the fall, you'll see that there'll be some traces of paper, but just about everything else will be gone. If you do put in meat bones or something like that, then they will eat all of the cartilage and all that on the bones, but it will take a very, very long time for the bones themselves to break down unless there's some intervening grinding.
Great, thank you. And the second question there, the worms that I have inside my home in that tub are the red wrigglers. And
Yes.
I know they're sensitive to temperatures lower than 50 and higher than 85. So I can't put those babies outside at all. I mean, would it make any sense to put some red wrigglers out in that soil, knowing they're going to die in the winter, or can they be used outside?
Well, one of the things I didn't get to that could be added to this is there are ways of making worm shelters outside. If they have, now they are sensitive to very low temperatures and also very high temperatures, but if you have a large worm bin that serves also maybe as a garden bench, for our stealth, triple use of space. If they're in a large enough space, and particularly if they're on the ground, then they can retreat and they can survive our winters and they can get away from the heat as long as they're in the shade. Many of them will die. If you throw them into the garden soil, they will die because that's not their environment. But if they are in an area where you then heap leaves on top of them, quite a few of them will make it through the winter. I also had thank you for bringing this up because I should have included it in this PowerPoint. I also had a large wooden worm bin that was made out of a 4x8 sheet of plywood, so it was 8 feet long, and in it I had a light bulb on an outdoor extension cord, and the light bulb was inside a metal paint can so that the worms wouldn't get burned on it and so that the light bulb wouldn't get wet. And that amount of heat actually kept the worms alive through the whole winter.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hi, yeah, I have a question that sort of piggybacks on the worm
Yeah.
issue. So I do plan to make this worm tower out of these Norman bricks with the holes in them, and I'm going to put it. I'm in a community gardens, and I've got my plot. It's 10 by 10, so I'm going to put 4 of them in, like 3 foot in, like each corner basically, but 3 foot in, so they're centered. I'm wondering. A lot of the people that are doing worm towers, even outside, they're saying, oh, put these worms in. I'm wondering, how do I need to really worry? I can just use the worms that are in the plot, right? They're already in the ground. They're not going to be worried about the temperature the way red wigglers would.
Well, the advantage of relying on the worms that are already in the soil is that you don't have the eccentric concern about their needs. And if you put in a lot of materials like dry leaves or materials like that that provide them with a lot of bedding along with whatever you're composting, just make sure you put in wood chips, things like that, that really give them a nice environment. You will attract enough composters that are already present in your garden, assuming you have, lively soil. They will come and they will multiply in that perfect environment that you're giving them. The only thing you really need to do is kind of monitor the water when it gets very hot in the summer. But you'll be watering your garden anyway, so you can put some water into these composting areas, and I think you'll have great success.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you. I plan actually to put stepping stones on top as well as the cap, because I don't have that much room, right? So it's kind of like building it into the plots. We're going to see how it goes. It's an experiment.
Well, I think it's a great idea, and then you don't have the problem of having the pavers and making the hole too big and then the paver falls down. So with you using those bricks, that's perfect. And in an urban environment, making every space work twice, maybe 3 times is ideal. So a great idea. I think you should, if you have time, send in some pictures, and it would be great to share them. I did neglect on the PowerPoint, which will be available through DPR through Josh Singer, but my email address is KD, as my name is Kathleen McLenn or Kate McLenn. It's KD_McLenn, which is MCLYNN @me.com. So if anyone has any further comments or want any copies or any links of anything that was in this PowerPoint, please just drop me an email and I'll send it back to you. And I hope that you will send pictures of your brick structures with the stepping stones on top. I think that's fabulous.
Thank you. I talked to Josh about it just to make sure that I was sort of following DPR's rules, and I definitely will chronicle it, capture it and send him the info to share as well, but I can share that with you too.
Oh, that would be great. I think that's a great idea.
Thank you.
All right. So do we have more questions or different ways of doing it? I'm going to send in to Josh. There's a company that is selling worm benches to use outdoors with the same idea as Janie was doing with trying to compost indoors, but also outdoors. And you can sit on them. You can put them inside a raised bed. They are rather expensive, I thought, and which is one reason I didn't include them, but they're a terrific idea. And theirs are also made out of a hard plastic, rather like a milk crate, which I wasn't sure was up to DC rats, but well, there are other ways of dealing with it. And of course, when they're contained inside bricks and then down below soil, there's no odor, that's probably not a big problem, but I'll be sure to send that link in to Josh so that everybody can have access to it. And then once they see the model, they can riff their own adaptation for our urban stealth composting needs. Well, this has been great. I hope everybody stays in touch, and really glad to do this. And I'm sorry we ran over a little bit, but I always welcome everyone's comments, and I hope you continue to comment and stay in touch. Thank you very much, and I hope you all go out there and do some stealth composting.